Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to piece a double Y seam as shown here on the Quilty Friends Hero block. Before we get started on the Y seams, I want to talk about how to manage a large scale block like this, and the most important thing is to keep your block neat and tidy. So let's talk about that. The first thing you'll notice is these sections of what looks like random machine basting. So when I'm done stitching a template and it looks like there's a flappy piece on the end that's perhaps just joined at one side, I switch my stitch length down to about 5 or 6 and I just put a little section of stitching around the area that's loose, and that just keeps it nice and controlled and prevents it from getting caught under a seam down the line. My next tip is when you're sewing a seam across another seam, remove the paper in the seam allowance in the template in the seam that you're crossing. It just reduces a lot of bulk, and when you get to that little bottom corner you don't have lots of layers there and it keeps it a lot neater. Okay, let's get to the double Y seam. It's called a double Y seam because there are two Y seams, but they're joined by one common piece, which is this center piece over here. We're going to start by stitching the Y seam on the left, and then we'll go to the one on the right hand side afterwards. The point where the Y seams meet is marked on each of the 3 templates that forms a part of the Y, and at the middle of it is a tiny little dot, and that is the most crucial part to pay attention to when piecing these Y seams, because it's the point where everything comes together. Okay, so the first seam we're going to sew is the top of the center section. Then this angled seam above AA, and finally on that Y, the vertical section. After that, we'll do the angled section above EE, and the last one will be the last vertical. Okay, let's get to it. So we're going to put this section right sides together on top of the big section at the top. Give it a clip in the center just to hold it in place while we're figuring out if we have the dots in the right spot. Then take a pin and stick it right through that tiny little center dot and check the other side to see if you have it in the dot on the back. As you can see, mine is slightly off, so I'm going to remove the clip in the middle and shift it over ever so slightly, and then see if I can get the 2 dots to align again with the pin. There we have it. So once that's aligned, then I can go to the other side, so I'll clip that in place. And then I'm going to the other side to see if the pinhole on that side is aligned, so that the 2 ends are perfectly aligned. And then we clip all the way along to hold the 2 sections in place so that we can sew them. So there you have the one on the right is perfectly aligned and the one on the left is perfectly aligned. So now I'm good to go, and I'm basically going to clip this whole lot together and then take it to the machine. Awesome, so that's ready to go. So we're going to start about a ½ an inch before the little dot, and so into that dot, stop with your needle down, and then sew along the seam to the next dot, and then backstitch away from that dot. And it's really important not to sew past the dot into the seam allowance area, because if you do, you'll get a tuck in the middle of your Y seam. The next tip I have is, instead of backstitching into the first dot, I actually sew forward into mine. It's a little bit cumbersome to set your fabric up, but once you do, you can really see where you're going, because you do want to stop with your needle down exactly in the middle of that dot. So if you're going forwards, you can see where you're going instead of it being hidden behind your foot. So I've set it up here, and you can see I'll take this clip off. You just need a few stitches to sew into that dot. So there I am, I'm parked right in the middle of the dot, and then I'm going to swing my entire piece of work around 180 degrees. And then just stitch all the way along the seam and backstitch when you get to the next dot. And again, once you get to this dot, it's really important not to go past it. Stop right in the middle of the dot and then backstitch out. So you can see that's perfect. It ends right at the dot and there's no stitching in the seam allowance area. Now we'll just open this up and give it a nice finger press. So that's great. Now we're going to add the section on this side over here, starting with the top seam. And it's basically exactly the same as what we've just done on the other seam, excepting for the fact that we first need to tuck this little bit of seam allowance out of the way so that that little bit of seam allowance from that center section of the T there doesn't get caught in the Y seam. So we're checking our dots to see if they're aligned. Tuck that little bit of seam allowance out the way and clip it. And then go ahead and clip all the way to the end of the seam. So again, we're going to start on this end where the dot is, about a ½ an inch before the dot. So forwards into the dot, needle down, switch the project around 180 degrees and then stitch all the way out to the other side and backstitch. And do a quick check when you remove the pin here before you start stitching, just to make sure that that seam allowance is still tucked out of the way so that you don't get it caught in the seam. So I'm stopped with my needle down. The seam allowance is still tucked out the way, which is great, and now I'm going to swing it around. And then just finishing up this seam to the end and back stitching when you get to the end. Awesome, we're almost done our first of the 2 Y seams. Now we're going to sew down this seam here. So it's basically the same drill again for the last seam. The first step is to tuck the seam allowance of the piece that we're not stitching out of the way, and then aligning the 2 templates or the 2 sections left and right sides together. Clip them together to hold them in place. And on this one we want to also take care to align those 2 horizontal strips above and below all the text areas. So you can see here I'm just paying attention to where those horizontal seams came in and just checking that they're nicely aligned, because then those strips at top and bottom of the text will line up nicely. Clip it all together, and then we will start sewing on the end of the seam that is closest to the dot. So into the dot, stop needle down, and then stitch all the way out to the end and back stitch. Look at that, perfection. So let's give it a press and see how nice and flat it lies. So you can see there it's lying beautifully flat, and on the back side I've nested the seams to not have too much bulk build up, so it's nice and flat. So for the other side it's exactly the same. You start at the top, sew into the corner, sew out, and then do the vertical seam. So I'll speed this up for you just to have a little recap. But if you get stuck, backtrack to the first one we did and you can see how to do it. It's exactly the same on both sides. So I've lined up my pins here back to front, clipping it in place, and then all the way to the end, clipping the whole seam. Then I'm stitching forward into the point, needle down, then turning the whole thing around 180 degrees and stitching the rest of the seam to the end. Beauty! That turned out perfectly. And now for the final vertical seam. It's just a little one. It is a bit clunky at this stage because you're dealing with a cumbersome block, but just go carefully and slowly. It's not far to go now. So the only difference for me on this final seam was because of the size of the block, and it becomes quite a chunky block to maneuver around. I decided that instead of stitching forward into the Y seam point, I actually back stitched into this last one. I just went slowly and carefully, you know, a couple of stitches at a time or one stitch at a time until my needle was down, and then came out and went forward after that. So that's it, we're done. Look at that, it's a beautiful block. This is a huge accomplishment, and I really hope that you have all really enjoyed making the block. I hope the video was helpful to you. Let me know what you think in the comments, and look forward to seeing your pictures posted on Instagram. Don't forget to tag them with Quilty Friends Pattern. See you around.